My name is Jeff Ludwig. I'm the Director of Education. I've had a lot of fun coming up with remote content ideas, and everyone at the Stewart House knows it's a poor substitute for coming to see us. We really look forward to having the house open again for visitation. That's got to be Maria. Sure is. Good, Maria. I'm glad it's working. For today's talk, I thought I'd keep it sort of a bit lighter, more upbeat. And I've pulled out and done some tinkering with the talk I'd created for Valentine's Day. We're usually closed in February, but it's a great time for us to go out in the community and venture into libraries. The last time I gave this talk actually was for the Inns of Aurora, and I've added on to it a little bit since then. I've called it Seward in Love, a 19th century political romance. And I will try today to keep my talk time down to closer to 45 minutes than an hour plus. I hope you're all able to respond. Maria, as you've heard, she's just texting me, is listening. She's at the helm of our Facebook account, and so she'd love for you to say hello, give us your name, where you're watching from, ask any questions that occur to you throughout the course of today's talk, and we'll also save some time for the end to do a Q&A forum as well. So I hope you'll stay along with us, stay engaged the whole time. Anything occurs to you, type it out. So, a love life alive in letters and its complications. What I thought I would do today is sort of three-part presentation. Talk about changing romantic conceptions of love in the time of William and Frances Seward. There they are. To my left, Mrs. Seward, Frances Miller. She was born 1805 and grows up in the house at 33 South Street, built by her father, Elijah Miller. And then her husband, William Henry Seward, born 1801 in Florida, New York. I want to explore their courtship today and their marriage, which was one that certainly knew its fair share of strain. They spent a lot of their married life actually living apart, which was often quite tragic for them. But for historians in the 21st century, it affords us a wonderful entree because throughout a long marriage, they correspond almost daily at certain points, or twice daily. So we can go back, read their mail, go into the archives. I'm going to draw on some letters today. I'm using them from the wonderful resource, which is the University of Rochester's Seward Project. It's sewardproject.org, and you can search by year, recipient. It's a great repository of family correspondence and some remarkable letters between William and Frances. And I want to look at some of the loves that came before Frances. So love in the time of Seward and love of Seward. Let's go big picture first. William Henry Seward, born 1801, so really the twilight of the 18th century, age of Enlightenment, and the birth of a new age of Romanticism. And the Enlightenment, sweeping across the world in the 18th century, gave rise to a number of new beliefs. Crumbling were traditional thoughts that peoples were perhaps irrational and could not be trusted to use their heads, to build up knowledge, to make smart, informed decisions, to be free agents. Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers and philosophers thought that wasn't true. Given their incredible capacity for growth and progress, people were inherently smart and given the resources, could make good choices for themselves without having to defer to some of the traditional old authorities that governed and really circumscribed the lives of most people pre-Enlightenment, being deferential to authorities like the church, the crown or state, the patriarchal head of house and family. While the Enlightenment is built on precepts of reason and knowledge, it also sort of opens individuals up for making greater choices, taking greater control and autonomy in their lives. And while it's an age of the head and not an age of the heart, it's not a far leap to process how this can go from thinking quite rationally and coolly about what was best for oneself to letting one's emotions dictate and govern how they made decisions, which is a really fancy and complicated way of saying, you go and read the quote here, that during the 18th century, society encouraged young people to select marriage partners based on romantic attachments. decided change from past practice when marriages had been arranged to cement relationships between families or clans to consolidate fortunes. Brides and grooms' feelings were not considered to be a paramount consideration. This is changing, in fact, really changing for the young generation that would include William and Frances Seward. They were encouraged to go out there and make their own informed choices. You're going to spend the rest of your life with the person that you marry, so you should have some say in who that person is. And as the 19th century opens and unfolds, often that will mean opening up one's heart, following one's heart, and making perhaps irrational and emotional choices based on things that are ephemeral, like physical attraction, romantic desire. These were all things that were supposed to be depressed and suppressed, held in check. For William and Frances Stewart, it's sort of opening up this whole Pandora's box of feelings and letting those guide your choices. Make choices for yourself. We all take that for granted today. You get to choose your partner, choose who you love. And that was really a new concept, a new conceit for them. I'm drawing from the National Women's History Museum, Elizabeth Maurer, and her work. She writes that romance blossomed in 19th century America as men and women were encouraged to express their most intimate thoughts in letters. High literacy rates and a reliable postal service facilitated romantic communication. Letter writing culture flourished, and William and Frances are certainly indicative of that. Letter writing manuals provided sample love letters, and I've pulled one up. A gentleman to a lady disclosing his passion. You can see it's sort of a very sophisticated and intellectual language. It's very proper etiquette, and niceties are being observed in it, but also sort of an unloosing of new forces of love, things that a generation or two earlier people were told to hold that in. Don't make an impetuous, irrational sort of choice of the heart, but we need to sort of let the old controls govern. And we're going to get into some of William and Frances's letters. This is a time of transition. This doesn't happen overnight. And to be sure, a lot of the old constraints will still shape the choices William and Frances make as they fall in love with each other. Both sides will want their family's buy-in. They're going to need the blessing of both sides of the family, as of old. And they're going to think about financial considerations. And you can sort of see Frances and Henry in this time of change, where they're in between both the sort of old worlds of control and the new world of freedom when it comes to making a match. Let's get into the heart of William Henry Seward. Some things we often tell visitors about when you come to our museum. Some quotes. He was faithful, the words on his headstone. Love one another. The last words he's reported to have uttered before his death on October 10th, 1872. These are sentimental and emotionally meaningful words that Seward is associated with now forever. They've sort of become immortalized with him. There's a painting of young Henry by Inman. If you don't know who that artist is, go back in our video vault and watch some of our live stream tours of the art of the Seward House Museum. Let's get into his heart a little bit during this time of changing notions of romance, letting the heart lead itself. Before I get to Frances, let's talk about Henry's early love lives. You probably tuned in and heard my colleague Zach talking about William Seward's trip to Georgia as a young man in 1819. So William Henry Seward, really quick, that I know most of you have been following along, come to the museum, our members, our friends. William Henry Seward, as I say, born in 1801 in Florida, New York, is very young, tests into Union College at 15, and off he goes to Schenectady, where he applies himself strenuously to his studies, but often comes under some hard times owing to his father, who accuses his son of being profligate and is perhaps stingy with the allowance and the spending money. He's not able to keep up with the style of the other young boys, can't pay the tailor's bill. And at the end of the holidays of fall of 18, going into post-New Year's Day, 1819, William Seward and a classmate actually set off on their own. They're just teenage boys. And Seward makes it on his own steam all the way to Georgia, New York to Savannah to Augusta, and he finds work for himself in a little town in Putnam County, Georgia, called Eatonville, as a schoolmaster. And while he's there, it's an incredible story. His parents are trying desperately to get him to come home. He stays at a Major William Alexander's home. And this is an unsubstantiated story, but you can see a letter here, and you can see where Putnam County is. In the 1850s, when Seward is a U.S. Senator, charges come up. He's an 1850s anti-slavery senator, a leading voice in the anti-slavery movement. Charges come up from Georgia that during his time as a young man there, he was romantically involved with an enslaved woman who lived on Alexander's plantation. Her name was Millie. And in 1866, after the war and the end of slavery, a young woman named Rosetta Alexander writes to Seward and says that the Alexander family and her mother always said that Seward was her father, and she was seeking help in the unsettled time of early Reconstruction, and the whole Southern economy and society was in flux. There's no evidence whether Seward responded, and we're left to speculate what this means, whether this was an early or maybe the first romantic encounter of Seward's. Maybe it isn't, but a name that comes up when you read about Seward in his biographies, Millie Alexander. Another early relationship of Seward's, Ms. Jane Westcott of Goshen, New York. His family, as I say, prevails upon Seward. He comes back from Georgia late in the spring of 1819. He's missed the semester at Union, and he lives at home and will go back the following spring semester to complete his degree. And during that time, he meets a pretty young lady whose company he was quite fond of. She called him Henry, and they had the same social circle. He's apprenticing himself out to a lawyer. He's seeing her socially, and according to some of his friends, he pledges faithfulness to her. He was faithful, but he's also 20. On a evening hilltop summit in Goshen. But Seward's heart will not belong to Jane Westcott. He goes back to Union the following spring semester. He graduates and he goes to New York City, where, as you can read from Walter Starr's great biography, he devotes much of his energy to the pursuit and praise of women. 2 weeks ago, I gave my talk on Lincoln and Seward, and I talked about male friendship. I mentioned David Burden was Seward's great, close, sort of intimate boon companion. They shared everything with each other, all their inner worlds and thoughts and desires, and were incredibly close, just like Lincoln and Joshua Speed. Burden is kind of gives Seward the business that he's womanizing a bit in New York, writing in letters to each other. Burden, Seward's best friend, writes, "The gods forbid that I should draw you from your present situation, even in imagination. You have too many fair maidens at your disposal." And he calls Seward out. "Were you not publicly kissing the shoemaker's daughter on the street last night? What about Jane Westcott? You need to settle down." He gets out of New York, leaves late at the end of 1822, and arrives late 1822, early 1823 to Auburn. Walter Starr quotes William Seward settling in Auburn, and Burden's writing him, he's confused all these women in New York that you're writing me about, that you're interested in Auburn. You seem to have as many deities, and he means the angelic women that he's writing to Burden about, who he calls beautiful and high wit, as people in the good old days had devils. Seward's always writing to me about the fine women of his acquaintance and exciting my imagining by the glowing pictures of female worth and delicacy that have come under his observation. And one pretty young lady who caught his eye was a Miss Marianne Kellogg of Skaneateles. Interestingly enough, you can drive along Genesee Route 28 through Skaneateles today and still see what was the Kellogg family house, the picture of it. And Marianne Kellogg was by all accounts, a beauty and the daughter of a very, very wealthy banker. And Seward was very interested in keeping her company. In fact, during 1823, he writes to Burden that he's pretty close to announcing himself, proposing marriage. Burden will destroy all of the letters actually that Seward ever writes him about Kellogg when this doesn't happen. At the same time, he's also keeping company with a young Francis Miller, and it seems like living in his boarding house in Auburn and working for Francis's father Elijah at Miller's law firm, he is wrestling with which of these two potential matches he would like to court and marry. There is not Francis Miller, but there is the Miller home, eventually Seward house. Seward's sister is the woman pictured here, Cornelia, who is something of the matchmaker who is pulling the strings on the other side of the coin. She and Francis had been classmates together at the Troy Female Seminary, or the Emma Willard School, and helps make an early introduction between Seward and Francis about 2 years earlier. And Seward's not sure he's good enough for Francis, frankly. I have too much regard, he writes, for her good sense to think of making overtures to her under present circumstances. Reduced to my last shilling and in debt, I will never ask nor demand the hand of any woman now until I'm ahead of this world as much as I am behind it. Ultimately, he will decide that he's more deeply in love with Francis and look to court her. And he's getting pretty serious about it in 1823 and 1824. And to the extent where, and here we see these worlds colliding, he wants and he needs the buy-in of his own father and Elijah Miller. So he writes to his dad why he thinks his father should approve and support his decision to propose marriage to Francis, declare himself for her. And he will also arrange for Francis to go out of town so he can have a one-on-one with Elijah Miller and announce his intentions and ask his blessing. But also he's made his own choice too. He's telling and asking at the same time. And he's sort of laying out for his father, these are the 3 rules I've decided I need in my romantic partner, my intended. There has to be mutual love. This is part of this new romance. He also wants a wife with a strong mind, together with a proper respect for him and financial security. Francis wins out on all 3 of these. Marianne Kellogg, by all accounts, blows hot and cold on Seward and sometimes seems disinterested. And this is the proper respect thing. Financial security, while Kellogg is wealthier than Miller, he's got 7 children, and Seward writes perhaps more on the way, and Elijah Miller has but 2 daughters. There seems to be a way out of this pauper's life he's imagining he's living in, and mutual love that, as he gets to know Francis, finds really does exist as a spark between them. Francis was indeed the complete package. And the wonderful Doris Kearns Goodwin's team of rivals, keep all my Seward books here, sums it up pretty nicely. It was in Judge Miller's country house that Seward courted and married Frances Miller, the judge's intelligent, well-educated daughter. Frances was a tall, slender, comely woman with large black eyes, an elegant neck, and a passionate commitment to women's rights and the anti-slavery cause. She was Seward's intellectual equal, a devoted wife and mother, a calming presence in his stormy life. This is another Inman, to harken back on one of my first talks. And when she sat for him in her early mid-30s here, he also described her as incredibly beautiful, incredibly intelligent. And everyone, it seemed, enjoyed Frances's company and commented on her as Goodwin has done here. Now, remember when I said that Seward gets Frances out of the house to visit a cousin and sits down, this is also straight from Goodwin, sits down with Elijah Miller, seen here, for a conversation. And as much as it's Seward sort of announcing his intention, he's made this Enlightenment-informed individual choice on his own, and he wants to marry Frances. There's still the vestiges of the past, and he needs Miller's consent. This was actually pretty important, because when a woman married in the early Republic in the United States, she surrendered a lot of her legal and social rights to her husband. She would be bound by the Old English notions of coverture, which said legally she is covered in her husband's person, and all that was hers defaults to him. Any inheritance or dowry that she comes with, any monies that she has or might make from properties would default to her husband. She would lose rights to take legal counsel and enter into contracts. And so legally, the choice on a woman's part to marry had these great ramifications. So Miller, a lawyer and judge himself, aware of that, and unfortunately his other daughter, Lizette, would make a worse choice and marry a rougher man who wasn't always kind to her, knew all too well that while these young hearts might think they know what they want on this day, there are long-term issues to be considered. And so there's a bit of a bargaining, a negotiation between father-in-law-to-be and William Seward. And here we have the fateful terms of the marriage for the blessing of the judge. If you are to marry my younger daughter, you'll be living in this house with me for the rest of my life. These are the terms. I wonder if Miller worried that Seward might take Frances back to New York City. Lizette, the older daughter, would be moved by her husband eventually to Canandaigua, New York, and maybe not wanting to be alone in his house or lose a bright young legal-minded Seward. Whatever it was, the pact is made, and these two men agree. William proposes marriage to Frances, and happily for him, she will have him. She says yes, and they do wed in the house, as Goodwin writes, in October of 1824. The bridegroom is 23, and the bride is 19. Family quickly follows. You can see here the Seward family's growth. To my left is Mrs. Seward with the three sons she would have. From her right, that is her oldest son, Augustus. In the middle, her youngest boy, William Jr., and the middle son, Frederick, all the way to the left. There we see William Seward in the other image, flanked by Will Jr. again. And then the little girl is Fanny. They have another daughter in between Fred and Will, named Cornelia, born 1836, passes away of smallpox in 1837. So love and family come to William and Frances. But as I said it earlier, it's complicated with Seward. It's complicated because of politics, what he will call his demon ambition, which often will do much to challenge, I don't want to say sabotage, but certainly I think complicate's the best word, complicate this 41-year marriage. And here we have it. Seward is 6 years married in 1830 when he takes his first political office, though he had been very interested in politics even earlier than that, going to conventions, giving speeches, considering a congressional run in 1828. A good lawyer, but hankering for something more. And here he writes in 1860 that he could not be well or happy at home, refusing to do what I can when called to the councils of my country. This also is sort of a neat and deft way around the pact with Miller. He's not really leaving the house to move Frances away to New York to take on private enterprise in the law. He's being called to the councils of first his state in New York and then his country. Here's Frances at the same time when her husband is considered the front runner for the presidency. Seward can't be very well at home. Frances just wishes it was over. Her ideal of happiness was domestic stability, to have a life with her husband actually home with her, raising children, the bonds of family, devout Christian, close friends, books. This was the world she wanted, and not a world that Seward could really deliver and give to her, because they were almost diametrically opposed in terms of where they wanted to go. And we'll come back to that. Pictured to the left is the governor's mansion after his time in the state senate. Seward to be a two-term governor, a two-term senator. And here's an image you might recognize from my Lincoln talk. It's the 1860 candidates. There's Seward front and center, presumed to be the president. And he will often, indeed, be called away from home by these councils. When you come to visit us at Christmas time, one of the things that our resident Mrs. Seward, portrayed brilliantly by some of our great volunteers, Audrey McNally, Coralie Hunter, she bemoans as she receives her holiday callers that her husband, over a 40-year career, makes it home for all of about 9 Christmases. Not very many. They'll spend a lot, considerable amount, the majority of their married life living apart, because they are so constitutionally different. Frances tries out life in the capitals. She spends about half of Seward's Senate career in session in Albany, comes to the governor's mansion, which we can see back here, Kane's Walk, Seward's governor's mansion. When she can, a couple of years when Seward's early in his Senate career, will come for part of the year in Washington, but by and large, she's at home. Whether that means it's because she's taking care of her aging father, a large family, her sister Lizette moves back home, or also, and these are not mutually exclusive, she has her own political thing going on, which I'd love to do in a future talk. She's involved, as Goodwin wrote, in the women's rights movement. She's responsible for managing her house as a stop on the Underground Railroad. So she's staying in Auburn, where she's got her roots and noble purposes. And so the marriage will be conducted over the course of many miles and thousands of letters over this 40-ish year period of Seward's political life. Francis is happiest when Henry's home. He's happiest when he's on the road or in the capitals, and they can't quite seem to bridge their dreams together. Seward certainly wished that Francis would come and move in with him wherever he went, and she wished in turn that he would just settle, stay home, and neither really got what they wanted. And we're going to explore that, unpack that a bit in the letters very soon. This love through correspondence. I meant to say, this is Francis's laptop desk from the Seward House Museum's library, where I like to imagine her writing the daily letter. As you can see, this is the office in the house, but Seward's traveling desk, where he would have been holding up his end of the correspondence chain. They're a political power couple. There's a lot to unpack in some of these letters. I much like this quote from Patricia Johnson, early historian and biographer who considered Fanny Seward and Mrs. Seward. And she writes that through all their marriage, William Henry had written her almost daily when they were apart. Above all, he wrote to her of politics. He kept her informed, shared his hopes and his uncertainties, and he sought her advice. He made her feel that her views were important, that she poured them out in letter after letter. When he was home, he read her speeches and public communications and sought her advice on matters of style and principle. He usually incorporated her suggestions. During the Compromise of 1850 speeches, she comes to Washington. As an example of a letter from Henry to Francis. You can see his handwriting here. Again, this is visible. You can go to the Seward Project at the University of Rochester and read to your heart's content. They're still working on it, but you can get lost during this time of COVID-19 quarantine in their letters to each other. And politics do come up quite a lot. In fact, in the talk I like to give on Francis, I talk about how she really emerges as her husband's moral compass, the angel on the one shoulder who always advises him to do what's right, who drives his idealism, as opposed to, say, Thurlow Weed, the campaign manager on the other shoulder, who advises Stewart to do what will further his ambition, do what makes him more popular, more electable, more likely to attain more power, higher office. And in that talk, I argue that Francis really is sort of a driver for a lot, and as Johnson writes, a framer of his thinking when he comes out strongly, as he does often, but not consistently enough always for Francis, on issues like anti-slavery. Here you can see she goes to Washington for that Compromise of 1850 debate to hear Seward's famous higher law oratory, and she writes that she was really never proud or never loved him more than when he took a stand and stood up there in his quaking little 5'6" form giving that speech. Seward certainly got the wife with a strong mind when she was unhappy, and I explore this further in that talk too. When it came to his politics, she would write him letters like this, my favorite Francis letter, in which she's not happy that he's taken to compromising over slavery. And you can see this sort of carte blanche criticism that Johnson notes. Eloquent as your speech was, my dearest Henry, it fails to meet the entire approval of those who love you best. And as you can read, she really lets him have it. If you want to learn more about this, comment as such to Maria. And next time I give a talk, it could be this one. But I want to push past politics and back into the affairs of the heart, doing good on time. Now, you can, as I say, easily get lost in the Francis and Henry correspondence. Voluminous. They did write often. And so I made the choice for this talk, and I'm going to, originally, I'm going to keep to it today, that I would just choose a sort of narrow cross-section of their marital history and really explore that, knowing full well that I or anyone now can, thanks to the University of Rochester, really make a thesis out of this. You could explore the relationship between William and Frances from courtship to the deathbed, looking through these letters, and that would take us all day. We could be doing this Facebook Live until nightfall. So I've chosen the early period of Seward's political career, his state senate career, 1830 to 34, when we really see a lot of the patterns that will come to define their marriage emerge. One of them being, I think, that whenever Seward attains a higher office, first the state senate, governorship, senatorship, secretary of state, he's at first very insecure stepping into that new role, and he looks back for and he leans on Frances for emotional support, nourishment, and she always plays that part for him. And as he grows more comfortable in those offices, he lets go of that a little bit, and she misses the closeness that came from the insecurity. As he gains in confidence, the letters change tonally and quite dramatically. They are full of this sort of early age of romantic, lyrical, sort of sentimental, you might even say sappy. This was intended to be private, but of course it wouldn't be private, because often the letters would come in a bundle every week. And while William and Frances are writing once a day, you get 7 letters at once. There are stories of Frances being quite perturbed when the bundle of letters comes and the servant brings them to her father first, and he's having a look-see. But here we have a nice emblematic early 1831. He's taken the seat in 1830, and he goes to Albany, is installed in 1831. So he's just getting to Albany as a state senator. And writing here, the moon is pouring her silver rays upon me, just as she's pouring out the abundance of the same treasure upon you. Looking at the same bright moon, isn't that sweet? Through the distance, my window opens to the east, and I have stood half frozen at the casement, looking at it, thinking how many happy evening we've watched it through the window. He's thinking about his toddler Augustus and little baby Fred here, imagining that scene of domestic bliss, which he's left. Frances and Henry could have no way of knowing. He's essentially left it for the next 40 years. He's imagining what he's given up, being there in that room with her, the children asleep, and instead he's living this bachelorish life in Albany, a young and rather obscure state senator. A lot of the early letters, this is just an example, contain this sort of very fluffy, very thoughtful, romantic prose. And Frances returns the favor. This is a great example of Peter Crosby. Myself and our facilities manager, Mitch, will often portray him at the Christmas production. And you can see early on some of Mrs. Seward's distemper for him growing as he brings the letters in to Pa. Finally, she gets them to herself. And here's something, Doris Kearns Goodwin does a very nice job in Team of Rivals. You don't need me to tell you that. But one of the things I really like about her book is when she's building the biographies of these rivals who will form the Lincoln cabinet, she takes the time to unpack their relationships, and she looks at Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln's correspondence from Lincoln's time on the circuit, or when he is called away to the councils of his state or country. And she really explores some of the innuendo, the sense of a romantic and physical desire that is now impossible because of the distance. And so it sort of spills out in sometimes immodest prose in these letters. So it's sort of a longing for a physical relationship. And here's Frances imagining what naughty things she will say in the next letter. She's not quite like Mary Todd Lincoln in going a little bit further and writing a saucy letter. But there is always an element. Part of this romantic longing is for what the heart wants. And when you choose a partner based on the qualities of a budding romance, part of that, of course, is physical attraction. It forms these letters as well. Letters of love. Here's another one from Seward. You can see how long this letter was. Imagine writing a letter like this every day. This was a timely commitment. I just finished my letter to you, retired, hoping I should dream of you and the boys, but I was restless. I coughed. It seemed as if I could not sleep, although my whole system was wearied. Here he is still thinking for, and this is getting on to the end of his term as state senator, and he's still writing like this. These are incredible letters. Grieved I was alone, and worried that I was unworthy of your love, and of the favor of that beneficent being who gave you to me. Tell me in your own dear way that I am loved and cherished in your heart. There he is, looking for that security blanket. And they both prevailed upon the other to write often. They assured each other that no detail could be too trivial from either of their days. Either of their stray thoughts conceived without the other would be unwelcome. Francis writes to Henry, remember that you cannot describe anything too minutely to interest me. 1,000 trifles which might be deemed unimportant to others will have attractions in my eyes from the circumstances of your being the narrator. Write often. Seward does. My heart is with you and beats with every impulse which you, beautiful and affecting, ought to call forth. I will not fail to write again and better, and that right soon. Your own affectionate Henry. Constantly in all my thoughts, and the pleasure I enjoy in writing these letters is of itself an inducement sufficient to make me avaricious of time to write them. And they don't need those style guides for letter writing. They had it down pat. It wasn't all skittles and rainbows, though, in the early marriage of William and Frances Seward. The tensions of distance would often rear their heads. Frances is unhappy, and she lets Seward know that. As much as she's offering security and stability and trying to boost his confidence in these letters, she lets him know she doesn't always appreciate how long he's gone, or that when he does come home, he'll sometimes take his time doing it. Getting out of the legislative session in Albany, he might go and spend some time with Thurlow Weed before he comes home. In 1833, at the end of the session, he goes traveling around Europe with his dad, and he's got young children at home. Seward's sister Cornelia, recall her sort of being our matchmaker figure, will write to him, you've got a family at home and you need to be there for them. There was a fear that the boys, Augustus and Fred, were confusing Judge Miller with the father figure in their lives. And there is a vacuum caused by Seward's absence, and it's often a source of pain and tension. Here you can see Frances trying to overcome it in 1831, asking for a miniature of her husband. I want a picture to look at him because he's not actually there to hold. And here she is kind of saying, not even kind of, she's really saying in this April 1832 letter, this is getting hard. I'm no flatterer, Henry, least of all to you would I speak in sincerity. But it is obvious be your merits what they may, that you are the pride and hope of your parents and kindred. I, who love you best of any, would once have pointed to a different path for us, for them, as more likely to secure peace of mind. But the time has gone by, and though my views remain unchanged, the domestic bliss she was hoping to find in her husband, a lawyer who would stay home, remains unchanged. I cannot find it in my heart to advise a course which would mar the happiness of so many who love you kindly, if not so well as your own Frances. She's saying a lot with a lot of words, but you can really read what she's getting at here. And there are moments when it looks like their marriage may flounder. Seward comes back from his trip with his father in 1833. In 1834, he runs unsuccessfully for governor. It causes quite a hardship, and there's some depression. And while he's away, a friend of his named Albert Tracy, a state senator about a decade older than Seward, these two were great friends in Albany. Seward regarded Tracy as something of an older brother, and he and Thurlow Weed and Seward were young up-and-coming players in the Whig Party in Albany in the 1830s. Seward admired, Tracy's wife, Harriet. Frances was brought in, and families spend time together. While Seward is away, Tracy spends a lot of time in Albany, and where Seward's rented place was in Albany as a state senator. And Frances is there with the boys for a while, and Tracy's playing with the boys and spending evenings with Frances. And Frances writes at one point to Lizette, I think I love him a little bit. And Something happens. We don't know what. Letters were burned, but something perhaps untoward or inappropriate, or at the very least imprudent, where Frances comes in tears to Henry with the letters that she and Tracy have been exchanging. Perhaps he made an advance. Perhaps he just took too many liberties. But Seward, in that moment, finally had come crashing home for him the cost of being away so much and perhaps inattentive. Despite these letters, he might lose his wife. He might lose Frances. He's not been a very good husband. He breaks off the closeness with Tracy right away. And in an amazing outpouring of letters from November and December 1834, the governor's race is over. The Senate term is over. He's preparing to come home. He writes all these letters about how he'd been unworthy of her during these years and how that nearly shipwrecked them, how much precious time for love has been irrevocably lost, how much suffering I have caused you, I can never atone for it. And here it is. What a demon is this ambition. How he has deceived me by assuring the noble purpose and the intellectual means. Your destiny has been interwoven with mine, been led away in thought, purpose, communion, and sympathy. And here he is. You're right. You're right. And listen to this. I have listened unheeded, nay, turned from you, with pity for your feminine weakness when you reminded me, this, Henry, is the anniversary of our marriage. Clearly he forgot. And do you remember, loved one? This is the birthday of our firstborn. Clearly he forgot. There's a lot of making up to do for a rapprochement. And Seward's game for trying, he admits, confesses to her in these thoughtful letters in which young lovers bare their souls, don't hold back, share everything. He says, you're right. I made my love so desolate, so destitute of sympathy for you, of everything which you ought to have found there, that you could no longer dwell in it. And then the wretched T, that's Tracy, took advantage of my madness and offered his sympathies and feelings and love, such as I had sworn. And your expelled heart was half won by his falsehoods. Still, I did not know and see that I was the criminal. God be praised for the escape of both of us from that fearful peril. And Frances forgives him, sort of. Let's try again. And she says, thinking of you, my dearest, and you're too hard on yourself. You approach yourself, dear Henry, with too much severity. But she says something that really hurts to hear. I realize most forcibly that love is the whole history of woman and but an episode in the life of a man. Perhaps this is what's the consequence of these decisions made now in an age of romanticism and romantic, emotional, sentimental choice. Seward will try to assure her that that is not so, that his love for her was not fleeting, it was not ephemeral, it was not tied to that early initial attraction, and he's going to make good on all the things that they promised to each other when they were young and in love and made their own choice to have and to hold each other. So he comes home, his and her letters side by side, and again, see how much they squeeze onto the page. And we're very lucky that the University of Rochester has transcribed these for us. So we can read the type without having to decipher the cursive. Your love can be my guide. That's how they decide to come out of this. He's saying, going forward, it's going to be different. Your love can be my guide, my support in producing the state of mind and feeling proper for asking the grace which is indispensable to the first step. Does that love continue strong enough to undertake the task and to preserve it? I feel the necessity for its aid. I feel at this moment, as I have all along, that if this important change is to be wrought in my heart, I must, in a humble and not irreverent sense, owe it to you. We can get through this. They do, obviously. And again, this is a micro cross section. 4 years. You can see the love, the passion, the hardship, the same things that married couples, all couples, go through over the course of a relationship, which are hard. And for us to be able to sort of have the whole thing brought open, it's an incredible treasure trove for historians looking to understand the social history, the intimate world of a couple like Frances and Henry, who will continue to correspond and make a go. And I dare say the love that Frances bears him will often be a guide, though the pattern tends to continue where as he rises higher, he reaches a point where he tends to write less and take her advice less and use that love as a guide less, but always comes back in the end. The letters slow down. You can see these are 1860s letters now from William and Frances, and there's less to say. The die has been cast. They're apart. They're in their almost 60 in these letters, and so the letters slow down. There's less in them, but that's not to say they're not worth reading. They become a lot more about politics and less about romance. For Seward, the apotheosis of his career is losing the presidency only to become Lincoln's Secretary of State and sort of linchpin of the team of rivals cabinet. But this is also the nadir of their marriage. Seward is often so busy, he loses track of time. He's not writing the letters that he should, not often enough. He's not answering Frances's questions. And then, of course, at the end, 155 years ago on Tuesday was the anniversary of the assassination of President Lincoln, an assassination attempt against William Seward. 41 years, just about, after their marriage. Lewis Powell, who you can see here, a co-conspirator along with John Wilkes Booth, is able to gain entry into Seward's Washington home, where Frances actually is, tending to her husband after he suffers a near-fatal carriage accident. Powell cuts a swath through the home, injuring Augustus, injuring Frederick, badly stabbing Seward and scarring him around the face, nearly taking his life. The true victim, of course, of that night was none of the Seward men, but very much Mrs. Seward, who would die about 8 weeks later, having seen her husband, her sons survive, and watching sort of the final days of war, and one of perhaps its last casualties, a war that claimed so many lives. Seward would later write, when describing why in his retirement he did not often stay home in Auburn, why he spent so much of his retirement traveling, despite being infirm and injured. He said he always worked hard to make the Auburn home a beautiful haven, worthy of his wife and daughter, with whom he'd hoped to spend his golden years. Deprived of that by her death in June of 1865, Seward had a hard time being there in the house. And as he retires, he embarks on 2 different and lengthy international journeys. Before he goes to visit Frances's grave, wipes away some dried flowers and places fresh ones there. A site of great meaning for Seward to visit this beautiful place, the urn done by Emanuel Leutze, who would do a number of paintings that we talked about in the Seward house. And today, side by side at Fort Hill Cemetery, a place worthy at any time of a pilgrimage, is where the story of their romance ends. I've enjoyed sharing that story with you. And again, we've really just scratched the tip of the iceberg.